A stranger demanded that I hand over my engagement ring because it was her stolen family heirloom. She expected me to apologize and hand it over. She did not expect what I did next. My fiancé Hollis proposed to me with a ring he designed himself. He spent months working with a jeweler to create something completely unique. The center stone was an oval sapphire surrounded by small diamonds in a vintage-inspired setting. He chose sapphire because it was my favorite color and because he wanted something different from traditional engagement rings. The band had delicate filigree work that made it look like something from another era. It was the most beautiful piece of jewelry I had ever owned, and I loved it because of what it represented. Hollis put thought and care and creativity into designing something just for me. The ring wasn't inherited or passed down. It was brand new, custom made, and purchased with money Hollis saved for over a year. I knew the entire history of my ring because Hollis told me the story when he proposed. He showed me sketches he made during the design process. He introduced me to the jeweler who brought his vision to life. There was no mystery about where my ring came from or who it belonged to before me. It belonged to no one before me because it didn't exist before Hollis created it. That's why I was completely blindsided when a stranger approached me at a coffee shop and demanded I hand it over. I was waiting for my drink when a woman around 50 years old walked up to me with an intense expression. She stared at my left hand for several seconds before speaking. She asked where I got that ring. I said my fiancé gave it to me. She said that was impossible because that ring belonged to her family. She said it was stolen from her mother decades ago and she had been searching for it ever since. She said I needed to return it immediately because it was her rightful property. I looked at this stranger making bizarre claims about my engagement ring and genuinely didn't know how to respond. I told her she must be mistaken because my ring was custom designed and made new within the past year. She said I was lying or had been lied to. She said that specific ring with that specific sapphire had been in her family for 4 generations. She said she would recognize it anywhere because her grandmother wore it in photographs she grew up looking at. She said the resemblance was exact, and there was no way it was coincidence. I told her again that she was wrong. She got louder. She said thieves always had stories to explain how they acquired stolen property. She said I probably bought it from some shady dealer who didn't ask questions about where jewelry came from. She said returning it was the right thing to do, and I should be grateful she wasn't involving the police. Other customers started watching our interaction. The barista looked concerned and asked if everything was okay. The stranger said everything would be fine once I gave her back what belonged to her family. I said I wasn't giving her anything because she was making false claims about my personal property. She said I was a thief protecting stolen goods. I said she was a stranger harassing me over a ring she had no connection to. She said she had plenty of connection because that ring was her inheritance. I asked if she had any proof of what she was claiming. She said the proof was her word and her family's history. I asked if she had photographs or documentation or anything concrete. She said she didn't need to prove anything to a thief. I asked how she expected me to hand over my engagement ring based on her word alone. She said an honest person would do the right thing without demanding evidence. I told her I was not giving my ring to anyone, and she needed to leave me alone. She blocked my path when I tried to walk away. She said I wasn't leaving until we resolved this situation. She said she would follow me if necessary and make sure everyone knew I was wearing stolen property. She said she would stand outside my home and tell my neighbors what kind of person I was. She was threatening to stalk and harass me over a ring she had absolutely no claim to. The barista intervened and asked the woman to step back. He said she was causing a disturbance and needed to leave if she couldn't calm down. The stranger told him to mind his business because this was a family matter. He pointed out that we clearly weren't family and she was harassing a customer. She said he didn't understand the situation and should stay out of it. He said he understood enough to know she needed to leave. The manager appeared and asked what was happening. The stranger launched into her story about her family heirloom being stolen and how I was wearing it right now and refusing to return it. The manager looked at me. I explained calmly that this woman was a complete stranger who approached me with false claims and was now threatening to follow me home. I said my ring was custom made and I had documentation proving its origin. The stranger said documentation could be faked. The manager asked the stranger to leave the premises. She refused and said she had every right to be there. He said her right to be there ended when she started harassing other customers. He said if she didn't leave voluntarily, he would call the police. She said good because she wanted to report me for possessing stolen property anyway. The police arrived 15 minutes later. Number 2 officers walked through the door. The older officer introduced herself as Pearl Novikov and asked us to separate to different sides of the coffee shop. I moved to a table near the window. Pearl asked me to explain what happened. I told her I was waiting for my coffee when this woman approached me and claimed my engagement ring was her stolen family heirloom. I held out my left hand so she could see. I told her my fiancé had the ring custom designed less than a year ago and I had proof. Pearl asked what kind of proof. I explained that Hollis worked with a jeweler for months to create this exact ring, and I had photos of his original sketches. Across the room, the stranger was talking loudly to the younger officer. She mentioned her grandmother and the year 1980 and how she had been searching for decades. I pulled out my phone and showed Pearl photos from the design process. The first showed a pencil sketch with measurements. The date stamp was from 14 months ago. The next showed the oval sapphire marked in the center with small diamonds arranged around it. Another showed the ring in progress at the jeweler's workshop. Pearl asked if I had the jeweler's contact information. I pulled the business card from my wallet. The stranger's voice got louder. She was saying her grandmother's ring had been stolen from their house in 1982. She said she would recognize it anywhere. Pearl stepped away and called the jeweler. I could hear her describing my ring in detail. When she came back, she told me the jeweler confirmed creating this exact ring based on a custom design brought in by a customer named Hollis 8 months ago. The jeweler still had all the paperwork. The stranger started yelling that the jeweler must have used her stolen ring to make mine. Pearl asked the stranger if she had any documentation proving ownership. The stranger said she didn't need documentation because she knew what belonged to her family. Pearl asked about about photographs, police reports from the alleged theft. The stranger said the theft was never officially reported because her family didn't trust the police. Pearl explained calmly that legal ownership required documentation and proof. The stranger said her word should be enough. The manager approached Pearl and said he had security footage. Pearl went to review it. After 10 minutes, Pearl emerged. She told the stranger that the footage showed her blocking my path and refusing to let me leave. She said this constituted harassment and unlawful restraint. Pearl asked me directly if I wanted to press charges. I thought about the stranger threatening to follow me home and tell my neighbors I was a thief. I looked at her glaring at me with pure hatred. I said yes. The stranger exploded. She screamed that I was a liar and a thief. Pearl told her she was under arrest for harassment. The stranger tried to back away, but the younger officer moved to help. Together, they got handcuffs on her wrists, while she kept screaming that I would regret this, that the truth would come out, that her family would never stop looking for their ring. Pearl read her rights while the stranger continued yelling. Other customers moved out of the way as the officers led her toward the door. She twisted around to look at me one more time. She said I was wearing stolen property and everyone would know it. Then they took her outside. Pearl came back and asked me to come to the station to give a full statement. I called Hollis and told him everything. He said he was leaving work right now. He would bring all the paperwork from the jeweler. At the station, Hollis spread everything across the table. Receipts for the sapphire purchase, design consultation notes in his handwriting, progress photos, the final invoice with a detailed breakdown of materials and labor costs. Pearl photographed each document. Then she mentioned something that made my stomach drop. She said this wasn't the first time someone had reported an incident involving Constance and claims about stolen jewelry. 3 other people in the past 2 years had filed complaints about her approaching them and demanding they hand over rings she insisted belonged to her family. Each time the claims were proven completely false, but none had pressed charges, so Constance never faced real consequences. Pearl said that's why my decision to press charges was important. Constance clearly needed intervention. A week later, I got a letter from Constance's court-appointed lawyer. It requested that I drop charges in exchange for Constance agreeing to undergo a full psychiatric evaluation. The lawyer explained that Constance had been fixated on recovering her grandmother's ring for years, even though there was no evidence it had been stolen. Her family had tried to get her help before, but she had always refused. I called Hollis and we talked through the options for almost an hour. We agreed that getting Constance into treatment seemed more important than having her convicted, but I didn't want to leave myself unprotected if she came after me again. Hollis suggested I tell the prosecutor I would drop charges only if Constance completed a real psychiatric evaluation and agreed to a restraining order. The meeting happened at the courthouse 2 weeks later. Constance's lawyer presented documentation showing she had already started therapy with a psychiatrist who specialized in delusional disorders. He explained that Constance had somehow convinced herself that any sapphire ring matching a general description of her grandmother's jewelry must be the actual stolen heirloom. Her grandmother's ring had probably been sold or lost decades ago, but Constance couldn't accept that. The prosecutor read from the therapist's letter. Constance had been experiencing grief-related delusions since her grandmother's death 5 years ago. The ring obsession was how her unprocessed grief had shown itself, creating a quest that gave her purpose but completely disconnected her from reality. The therapist wrote that Constance genuinely believed she was recovering stolen property and had no idea she was harassing innocent people. Hearing that made me feel sad for her even though I was still angry. Mental illness was complicated. The judge approved our agreement. Charges dropped in exchange for Constance completing psychiatric treatment, accepting a 5-year restraining order, and paying my legal consultation costs. 2 months went by without any contact. Then I received a letter through Constance's therapist, a handwritten apology. Constance wrote that therapy had helped her realize she had been harassing innocent people because she couldn't accept her grandmother's death. She was genuinely sorry for frightening me and disrupting my life. She understood now that her quest to find the ring had been a way to avoid dealing with her grief and that she had caused real harm to real people in the process. The letter was 2 pages long and it felt sincere. I didn't write back because of the restraining order, but I kept it in a drawer. Sometimes I thought about how grief could twist someone's mind into seeing things that weren't real. Hollis and I visited the jeweler to thank him personally for his documentation and support throughout this whole mess. He mentioned he had started keeping even more detailed records after my incident. He now photographed every stage of creation and kept digital backups of everything. He said my case had taught him how important documentation could be. The coffee shop manager called to say they were using what happened as a teaching example for staff training on how to handle harassment situations. He offered me a gift card. It felt good knowing something positive came from such a weird experience. 6 months passed and Hollis and I were deep into wedding planning. We spent weekends looking at venues and tasting cake samples. I wore my ring every single day without thinking twice about it. No anxiety about someone approaching me, no fear of another confrontation, just pure happiness every time I looked at the sapphire on my finger. I learned that standing up for yourself with calm confidence and solid documentation is incredibly powerful. I learned that sometimes the person causing chaos needs professional help more than punishment. I was genuinely glad Constance was getting therapy and working through her grief in healthier ways. Everything worked out exactly how it should have.